Picture this. It's 3:27 a.m. on March 28, 1942, and you're a German sentry standing guard on the massive Normandy dock at St. Nazaire, the largest dry dock in the world and the only facility on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing Germany's most powerful battleship, the Tirpitz. The night has been unusually quiet, with only the distant rumble of what sounds like British bombers somewhere out over the Atlantic. You're cold, tired, and counting the hours until your shift ends, when suddenly the darkness explodes into chaos. Racing toward you at full speed through the harbor entrance is what appears to be a German destroyer, flying Nazi flags and flashing the correct recognition signals. But something is terribly wrong. The ship is moving too fast, ignoring all harbor protocols and heading directly for the massive steel gates of the dry dock. As the vessel gets closer, you realize with growing horror that this isn't a German ship at all. It's HMS Campbeltown, a British destroyer that's been disguised to look like a German vessel. And it's packed with over 4 tons of explosives set to detonate in less than 9 hours. What you're witnessing is the beginning of Operation Chariot, one of the most audacious and destructive commando raids of World War II, a mission so dangerous that it was nicknamed the greatest raid of all. In the next few minutes, this single ship will ram into the dock gates with enough force to destroy the most important German naval facility on the Atlantic coast, and the commandos aboard will fight one of the most desperate battles in military history. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, whether you're a naval history enthusiast in Portsmouth, a WW2 buff in Berlin, or discovering this incredible story from somewhere completely unexpected. I love connecting with our global community. The story you're about to hear will completely revolutionize everything you think you know about naval warfare, special operations, and the incredible lengths that desperate nations will go to achieve victory. Today, we're going to reveal how the British Navy turned an obsolete destroyer into a floating bomb, how 600 commandos launched a suicide mission against impossible odds, and how the destruction of a single dock facility crippled German naval operations for the rest of World War II. To understand how HMS Campbeltown came to be packed with explosives and aimed at the heart of German naval power, we need to go back to 1941, when Britain faced what many considered an impossible strategic situation that threatened the very survival of the nation. The German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the legendary Bismarck that had terrorized the Atlantic before its destruction, represented the greatest single threat to Allied shipping in the Atlantic Ocean. This massive vessel, displacing over 50 0 tons and armed with 8 15-inch guns capable of destroying any ship afloat, was a floating fortress that could single-handedly destroy entire convoys and force the Royal Navy to divert enormous resources to counter its potential threat. The Tirpitz was more than just a ship. It was a strategic weapon that could tip the balance of the entire war in Germany's favor if it ever broke out into the Atlantic shipping lanes. The psychological impact of the Tirpitz was almost as important as its physical capabilities. British convoy commanders lived in constant fear of encountering this monster, and the mere possibility of its presence forced the Royal Navy to provide massive escort forces for every convoy crossing the Atlantic. Resources that could have been used for offensive operations had to be held back to counter a threat that might appear anywhere at any time. The Tirpitz was based in Norwegian fjords, where it was protected by some of the most formidable natural geography on Earth and massive German defenses that made any direct attack virtually impossible. The ship was surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, torpedo nets, and thousands of German troops who had turned the entire area into an impregnable fortress. Any conventional attack on the Tirpitz in its Norwegian lair would require enormous resources with little chance of success. But British intelligence had identified a crucial vulnerability in the German strategy that could neutralize the Tirpitz threat without requiring a direct confrontation with the most powerful battleship in the German fleet. The key to the Tirpitz threat lay not in the frozen fjords of Norway, but in a small French port over 100 miles away on the Atlantic coast of occupied France. Saint-Nazaire, located at the mouth of the Loire River, housed the Normandy dock, originally built in the 1930s to service the massive French ocean liner Normandy, which had been one of the largest and most luxurious passenger ships ever constructed. This dry dock was absolutely unique in all of Europe. It was the only facility outside of Germany itself that was large enough and sophisticated enough to service and repair the Tirpitz if the battleship was damaged during Atlantic operations. The strategic calculation was brutally simple and elegantly logical. As long as the Normandy dock existed, the Tirpitz could operate freely in the Atlantic, knowing that it had a safe harbor for repairs if needed. The battleship could take risks and engage in aggressive operations because it knew that even if it suffered damage, it could reach St. Nazaire for repairs without having to make the dangerous journey back to Germany through waters controlled by British forces. But if the dock were destroyed, the entire strategic equation would change dramatically. The German battleship would be forced to return to Germany for any significant maintenance, a journey of over 500 miles through waters that were increasingly dominated by British naval and air forces. This limitation would severely restrict the Tirpitz's operational effectiveness and might even force the Germans to keep the ship in port rather than risk losing it during a long journey home for repairs. British naval intelligence had identified the destruction of the Normandy dock as a strategic priority that could neutralize the Tirpitz threat more effectively than any direct attack on the battleship itself. But the dock presented what seemed like an impossible target for conventional attack methods available to British forces in 1942. St. Nazaire was located deep inside occupied France, hundreds of miles from the nearest British base and surrounded by German-controlled territory. The port was defended by extensive coastal artillery batteries, anti-aircraft gun positions, patrol boats, and thousands of German troops who had turned the entire area into a fortress, designed specifically to protect one of Germany's most valuable naval assets. The dock itself was a marvel of engineering that had been built to withstand enormous forces. The facility was designed to handle ships weighing tens of thousands of tons, and its massive concrete and steel construction was intended to last for decades under the most demanding conditions. Any weapon capable of destroying such a facility would have to be extraordinarily powerful and precisely targeted. Conventional bombing attacks had been considered and rejected as impractical. The dock was too well defended by anti-aircraft guns for daylight bombing raids, and night bombing lacked the precision needed to guarantee destruction of such a specific target. Even if bombers could reach the target, there was no guarantee that conventional bombs would be powerful enough to destroy the massive dock gates and surrounding infrastructure. Naval bombardment was equally impractical, as it would require British warships to penetrate hundreds of miles into German-controlled waters and engage coastal defenses that were specifically designed to prevent exactly such attacks. The risks would be enormous, and the chances of success would be minimal. Into this seemingly impossible situation stepped Combined Operations, the British organization responsible for planning and executing special operations behind enemy lines. Combined Operations had been established to develop unconventional solutions to military problems that conventional forces couldn't solve, and the St. Nazaire problem was exactly the kind of challenge the organization had been created to address. The planners at Combined Operations understood that conventional military thinking was completely inadequate for the challenge of destroying the Normandy dock. Success would require a completely new approach that combined audacity with technical innovation, careful planning with willingness to accept enormous risks, and conventional military skills with unconventional tactical thinking. The plan that emerged from months of careful study and analysis was so outrageous that many senior officers initially dismissed it as the fantasy of planners who had completely lost touch with military reality. The British would convert an obsolete destroyer into a floating bomb, pack it with enough explosives to destroy the dock gates, and ram it directly into the target at high speed while German defenders watched helplessly. The ship would be accompanied by a force of elite commandos who would land throughout the port and destroy additional targets that were essential to the operation of the naval facility. These secondary targets included pumping stations, power facilities, fuel storage areas, and other infrastructure that would ensure the port remained unusable even if the dock gates were somehow repaired. The mission would require the raiders to penetrate some of the most heavily defended waters in occupied Europe, fight their way through a port that was swarming with German troops, accomplish their objectives while under intense fire, and then escape across hundreds of miles of occupied territory to reach safety in neutral Spain or unoccupied France. The chances of survival for individual participants appeared to be virtually zero, while the likelihood of mission success seemed only marginally better. But the strategic importance of the target was so great that British commanders were willing to accept almost any cost to achieve the objective. HMS Campbeltown, the ship chosen for this unprecedented mission, was a World War I-era destroyer that had been transferred to the Royal Navy from the United States as part of the Lend-Lease program that was keeping Britain supplied with essential military equipment. The ship was obsolete by 1942 standards, too slow and lightly armed to be effective in modern naval combat against German vessels that had been designed specifically for contemporary warfare. But HMS Campbeltown possessed exactly the characteristics needed for Operation Chariot, qualities that made it perfect for a mission that no modern warship could have accomplished. The destroyer was expendable, unlike the modern ships that the Royal Navy desperately needed for convoy escort duties and other essential operations. It was also exactly the right size to fit through the harbour entrance at St. Nazaire, while carrying enough explosives to destroy the massive dock gates. Most importantly, with careful modifications, HMS Campbeltown could be disguised to resemble a German destroyer of the Meaux class, potentially allowing it to approach the target without being detected until it was too late for the defenders to respond effectively. This deception capability was crucial to the mission's success, as it would allow the raiders to penetrate the outer defenses before the Germans realized they were under attack. The conversion of HMS Campbeltown into a floating bomb was a masterpiece of naval engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible with the resources and time available to British forces. The ship's forward sections were completely rebuilt to accommodate over 4 tons of high explosives, carefully arranged and shaped to create maximum destructive effect when detonated against the dock gates. The explosive charge was far more sophisticated than a simple pile of bombs. Naval engineers designed a shaped charge that would focus the explosive force directly against the dock gates, maximizing the damage while minimizing the amount of explosive material needed. The charge was designed to blow a hole in the dock gates large enough to render the facility completely unusable for years, even if the Germans attempted immediate repairs. The timing mechanism for the explosives was a marvel of precision engineering that represented some of the most advanced technology available to British forces. The device was designed to detonate the charges approximately 8 hours after the ship rammed into the dock gates, a delay that would serve multiple crucial purposes. First, the delay would give the commandos time to complete their missions throughout the port and begin their escape, before the massive explosion revealed the true purpose of the raid and brought down the full fury of German retaliation. Second, the delay would allow German personnel to approach the wreck and begin assessment and salvage operations, maximizing the casualties among German naval specialists whose expertise was crucial to port operations. But the technical challenges went far beyond simply packing a ship with explosives and setting a timer. HMS Campbeltown had to be modified to look like a German destroyer, a transformation that required extensive changes to the ship's silhouette, armament, and general appearance that would fool German observers who were intimately familiar with their own naval vessels. The ship's distinctive features had to be altered or disguised using materials and techniques that would withstand close inspection while maintaining the ship's seaworthiness and combat capability. New features had to be added to make the ship resemble German vessels that the defenders would recognize as friendly, including modifications to the superstructure, armament, and even the arrangement of equipment on deck. The disguise was remarkably sophisticated and detailed, involving changes to the ship's funnel configuration to match German destroyer profiles, the addition of fake German naval equipment and weapon systems, and even the installation of German naval flags and recognition equipment. The ship's crew was trained extensively in German signal procedures and naval protocols, learning to respond to German challenges in ways that would convince defenders that they were seeing a friendly vessel returning to port after operations. The attention to detail in the disguise was extraordinary. British intelligence had obtained detailed photographs and technical drawings of German destroyers, and every visible aspect of HMS Campbeltown was modified to match these specifications as closely as possible. Even the ship's paint scheme was changed to match German naval standards, and fake equipment was installed to create the proper silhouette when viewed from German observation posts. The commando force that would accompany HMS Campbeltown was composed of some of the most elite soldiers in the British Army, men who had volunteered for what they fully understood was likely a suicide mission with minimal chances of survival. The force included specialists in demolitions, close combat, navigation and escape and evasion, all skills that would be essential for the success of the mission and the survival of any participants who managed to complete their objectives. The commandos were organized into specific teams, each with carefully defined objectives and detailed knowledge of their particular targets. Some teams were tasked with destroying pumping stations that were essential to the operation of the dry dock, while others would attack power facilities, fuel storage areas, and communication centers that were crucial to German naval operations in the port. Each team had studied detailed models and photographs of their targets, memorizing the layout of buildings, the location of key equipment, and the most effective methods for destroying their objectives with the limited explosive charges they could carry. The planning was so detailed that individual commandos knew exactly which pieces of equipment to target and how much explosive would be needed to ensure complete destruction. The commandos also received extensive training in escape and evasion techniques, as those who survived the initial assault would have to make their way across hundreds of miles of occupied territory to reach safety. They studied escape routes, safe houses, and contact procedures for French resistance fighters who might be able to assist them during their journey to neutral territory. The training for Operation Chariot was intensive and comprehensive, covering every aspect of the mission from the initial approach to the final escape attempts. The commandos practiced their assault techniques on full-scale mock-ups of German positions that had been constructed using intelligence gathered by British agents and aerial reconnaissance. They rehearsed their movements until every action was automatic, ensuring that they could complete their missions even under the extreme stress of combat. The naval crews received equally intensive training in ship handling under combat conditions, learning to navigate through hostile waters while under fire and to coordinate their movements with the commando assault teams. They practiced the complex deception techniques that would be needed to approach the target without being detected, including the use of German signal procedures and recognition codes. The crews also trained extensively in damage control and emergency procedures, as they knew that HMS Campbeltown would come under intense fire during the final approach to the target. They had to be prepared to keep the ship operational and on course even if it suffered significant damage from German coastal artillery and anti-aircraft guns. On the night of March 27, 1942, HMS Campbeltown and her escort of 18 motor launches departed from Falmouth, England, beginning one of the most dangerous naval missions of World War II. The force represented the largest commando raid attempted to that point in the war, with over 600 men committed to an operation that most participants understood they were unlikely to survive. The force had to cross over 400 miles of ocean that was constantly patrolled by German U-boats, aircraft and surface vessels, any of which could detect and destroy the raiders before they reached their target. The Bay of Biscay was particularly dangerous, as it was heavily patrolled by German forces based in French ports and was within range of German aircraft operating from airfields throughout occupied France. The journey across the Bay of Biscay was fraught with danger and required careful navigation to avoid German patrol patterns while maintaining the precise timing needed for the assault. The raiders had to maintain complete radio silence while navigating through waters where German forces were constantly searching for Allied vessels, creating enormous psychological pressure on all participants. The weather conditions during the crossing were challenging, with rough seas that made the journey difficult for the small motor launches that accompanied HMS Campbeltown. Many of the commandos became seasick during the crossing, weakening them before they even reached the target and adding another layer of difficulty to an already nearly impossible mission. The constant threat of detection created enormous psychological pressure on all participants, as they knew that discovery during the crossing would mean certain death or capture with no possibility of completing their mission. Every aircraft sighting, every radar contact, and every unidentified vessel could mean the end of the operation and the loss of all hands. The approach to St. Nazaire required precise navigation and timing that left no room for error. The raiders had to arrive at the harbor entrance at exactly the right moment to take advantage of the tide conditions and darkness while avoiding German patrol schedules that had been carefully studied by British intelligence. The final approach was made in complete darkness, with HMS Campbeltown leading the formation of motor launches toward what appeared to be certain destruction. The ship's crew and the commandos aboard knew that they were sailing toward one of the most heavily defended ports in occupied Europe, and that their chances of survival were minimal at best. As the raiders approached the harbor entrance, they began implementing the deception plan that was crucial to the mission's success. HMS Campbeltown hoisted German naval flags and began transmitting German recognition signals that had been obtained through intelligence operations, while the crew prepared to respond to challenges from German defenders using procedures that had been carefully studied and rehearsed during months of preparation. The deception worked perfectly in the initial stages of the approach, as German defenders recognized the signals and assumed they were seeing friendly vessels returning to port after operations in the Atlantic. The raiders were able to penetrate the outer harbor defenses without being challenged, bringing them within striking distance of their targets before the Germans realized what was happening. The German defenders at St. Nazaire were experienced naval personnel who were familiar with their own vessels and procedures, but the quality of the British deception was so high that it fooled even these experts during the crucial initial moments of the approach. The raiders gained precious minutes of undetected approach time that would prove essential to the success of their mission, but as HMS Campbeltown approached the inner harbor, German sentries began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the ship's appearance and behavior that gradually aroused their suspicions. The vessel was moving slightly too fast for normal harbor procedures, and its silhouette didn't quite match that of any German destroyer they recognized, despite the careful modifications that had been made to disguise the ship. Alert German officers began to question the identity of the approaching ships, and some defenders started to prepare their weapons while they waited for confirmation of the vessel's identity. The tension in the harbor began to increase as more German personnel noticed that something was not quite right about the approaching formation. The moment of truth came when a German signalman challenged HMS Campbeltown with a recognition signal that the British crew couldn't answer correctly, despite their extensive training in German procedures. The deception was blown, and the German defenders suddenly realized they were facing an enemy attack of unprecedented audacity and scale. Searchlights blazed to life throughout the harbor, illuminating the water and revealing HMS Campbeltown and her escort of motor launches to the German gunners who had been waiting in the darkness. The element of surprise was lost, but the raiders were now so close to their targets that the Germans couldn't prevent them from completing their mission. What followed was one of the most intense and desperate naval battles of World War II, as German coastal artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and machine gun positions opened fire on the British raiders with everything they had. The harbor erupted in a storm of gunfire and explosions as both sides fought with desperate intensity for control of the port. HMS Campbeltown, now revealed as an enemy vessel and under devastating fire from defenders throughout the harbor, continued her charge toward the dock gates at maximum speed while her crew fought to keep the ship operational under impossible conditions. German shells crashed into the destroyer, killing and wounding crew members and damaging vital systems, but the ship maintained her course toward the target. The British motor launches, their mission now exposed and their deception blown, fought desperately to land their commando teams while under intense fire from German positions throughout the harbor. The small vessels were extremely vulnerable to the heavy German fire, and many were hit and sunk before they could reach their designated landing points. Despite the devastating German fire, many of the motor launches managed to reach their landing points and successfully disembark their commando teams, who immediately began their assault on targets throughout the port complex. The commandos, despite being under intense fire from the moment they landed, pressed on with their missions with extraordinary courage and determination. HMS Campbeltown despite taking numerous direct hits from German artillery that would have sunk a less sturdy vessel, maintained her course toward the Normandy dock at maximum speed. The ship's crew, knowing they were sailing toward certain death or capture, continued to fight their vessel with extraordinary courage and professionalism, returning fire at German positions while racing toward their ultimate target. The destroyer's engines continued to function despite damage from German shells, and her steering remained responsive enough to allow precise navigation toward the dock gates. The ship's crew worked frantically to keep their vessel operational while under fire, knowing that the success of the entire mission depended on their ability to reach the target. At 1:34 a.m. on March 28, 1942, HMS Campbeltown struck the dock gates of the Normandy dock with tremendous force, driving deep into the massive steel and concrete structure and wedging herself firmly in place. The impact was so violent that it could be felt throughout the port, and the sound of rending metal and concrete echoed across the harbor as the destroyer buried herself in the dock gates. The ramming was a complete success from a tactical standpoint, as HMS Campbeltown was now positioned exactly where she needed to be for maximum destructive effect when her explosive cargo detonated hours later. The ship had penetrated the dock gates far enough to ensure that the subsequent explosion would cause catastrophic damage to the entire facility. But the crew and commandos aboard HMS Campbeltown now faced the desperate challenge of fighting their way off the ship and attempting to escape through a port that was swarming with German defenders who were fully alert and determined to prevent any of the raiders from escaping. The ship was wedged firmly in the dock gates, making evacuation difficult and dangerous. The commandos who had successfully landed from the motor launches throughout the harbor began their carefully planned assault on targets throughout the port complex, fighting building-to-building battles against German defenders who were now fully alert and determined to prevent the raiders from accomplishing their objectives. The fighting was intense and close quarters, with both sides showing extraordinary courage and determination. The British commandos, despite being vastly outnumbered and cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or support, pressed their attacks with remarkable success and tactical skill. The commandos systematically destroyed pumping stations that were essential to the operation of the dry dock, ensuring that even if the dock gates were repaired, the facility would remain unusable for extended periods. They demolished fuel storage facilities that contained thousands of gallons of fuel needed for German naval operations, creating massive fires that illuminated the harbor and added to the chaos of the battle. Power installations throughout the port were attacked and destroyed, plunging large sections of the facility into darkness and disrupting German communications and coordination efforts. The commandos also destroyed lock mechanisms, bridges, and other infrastructure that would be essential for any German attempts to restore the port to operational status. But the cost of these successes was enormous, as the commandos faced overwhelming odds and had no possibility of escape once their missions were completed. The German defenders, once they recovered from the initial shock of the attack, began to organize systematic counterattacks designed to eliminate the British raiders and minimize the damage they could inflict. Many of the commandos were killed or wounded during the fighting, and those who survived found themselves trapped in a hostile port with no way to reach safety. The motor launches that had brought them to the target were either sunk or forced to withdraw under the intense German fire, leaving the commandos to fight their way out on foot or attempt to hide until they could begin escape attempts. The German response to the raid was swift and overwhelming, as thousands of troops converged on the port from throughout the region to hunt down the British raiders and assess the damage that had been inflicted. German commanders initially believed they had successfully repelled the attack, as HMS Campbeltown appeared to be nothing more than a wrecked destroyer that had been sunk in what they assumed was an unsuccessful ramming attempt. What the Germans didn't realize was that the real attack was still to come, and that HMS Campbeltown was sitting in the dock gates like a massive time bomb with her explosive cargo set to detonate in just a few hours. The German defenders, believing the immediate threat had passed, began to relax their vigilance and assess the damage from what they thought had been a failed British raid. German naval officers and technicians swarmed over the wreck of HMS Campbeltown, trying to determine how much damage had been done to the dock gates and how quickly repairs could be made to restore the facility to operational status. They had no idea that they were standing directly on top of over 4 tons of high explosives that were counting down to detonation. Senior German naval officers toured the wreck, assessing the damage and planning repair operations. Technical specialists examined the dock gates to determine the extent of structural damage and the resources that would be needed for repairs. All of these personnel were completely unaware that they were in mortal danger from the delayed action explosives hidden in the ship's hull. The German commanders were actually pleased with what they saw as a failed British attack that had accomplished little beyond the loss of an obsolete destroyer and numerous British personnel. They believed that German defenses had proven their effectiveness and that the port would be back to full operational status within days or weeks. At 10:35 a.m. on March 28, 1942, nearly 9 hours after HMS Campbeltown had rammed into the dock gates, the delayed action explosives finally detonated with devastating and catastrophic effect. The explosion was so powerful that it was heard for miles throughout the region, and the blast completely destroyed the dock gates along with a significant portion of the surrounding infrastructure and facilities. The explosion killed or wounded hundreds of German personnel who had been working on or near the wreck, including many senior naval officers and technical specialists whose expertise was crucial to German naval operations throughout the Atlantic. The psychological impact of the delayed explosion was enormous, as it demonstrated that the British had planned the raid with a level of sophistication and foresight that German commanders had not anticipated. The destruction of the Normandy dock was complete and devastating beyond anything the Germans had imagined possible. The massive facility, which had taken years to build and represented one of Germany's most important naval assets on the Atlantic coast, was rendered completely unusable for the remainder of the war. The dock gates were completely blown apart, with massive chunks of concrete and steel scattered throughout the harbor. The surrounding infrastructure was destroyed, including pumping stations, power facilities, and other equipment that would be essential for any repair efforts. The facility was flooded with debris that would take years to clear, even if the Germans had been willing to commit the enormous resources needed for reconstruction. The strategic impact of the raid was exactly what British planners had hoped to achieve, and it exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The Tirpitz was now effectively trapped in Norwegian waters, unable to risk operations in the Atlantic, without access to repair facilities that could handle a ship of its enormous size and complexity. The German battleship would spend the rest of the war as a fleet in being, tying down enormous Allied resources through its mere existence, but never again posing a direct threat to Atlantic shipping convoys. The destruction of the St. Nazaire facility had achieved the strategic objective of neutralizing the Tirpitz threat more effectively than any direct attack on the battleship itself could have accomplished. But the human cost of Operation Chariot was staggering and sobering. Of the 600-plus men who participated in the raid, only about 230 returned to Britain alive. Many were killed during the fighting in St. Nazaire, while others were captured and spent the rest of the war in German prisoner-of-war camps, where conditions were often harsh and survival was uncertain. The raid had succeeded brilliantly in its strategic objectives, achieving everything that British planners had hoped for and more, but the price in human lives was enormous. The success came at a cost that highlighted the desperate nature of Britain's strategic situation and the lengths that the nation was willing to go to achieve victory over Nazi Germany. The survivors of the raid who managed to escape from St. Nazaire faced an epic journey through hundreds of miles of occupied France, relying on French resistance fighters and their own military training to evade capture by German forces who were conducting massive searches for the raiders throughout the region. Some of the escapees managed to reach neutral Spain and eventually return to Britain, where they provided valuable intelligence about the raid's success and the German response. Others were captured during their escape attempts and joined their comrades in German prisoner-of-war camps, where they would remain until the end of the war. The stories of individual heroism during Operation Chariot were remarkable and numerous, representing some of the finest examples of courage and dedication in British military history. Commandos fought against overwhelming odds to complete their missions. Naval personnel continued to fight their ships even when facing certain death, and many men sacrificed their lives to ensure that their comrades could escape or complete crucial objectives. Today, as we face our own challenges and obstacles that seem insurmountable, the story of HMS Campbeltown and Operation Chariot reminds us that no objective is truly impossible if we are willing to think creatively, plan carefully, and commit ourselves completely to achieving our goals. The raid showed that the most effective solutions often come from approaches that conventional wisdom considers too dangerous or too audacious to attempt. The next time you face a challenge that seems impossible to overcome, remember HMS Campbeltown racing through the darkness toward the dock gates at St. Nazaire, her crew knowing they were sailing toward certain death, but determined to complete their mission regardless of the cost. Remember that they succeeded, not because they had overwhelming force or superior technology, but because they were willing to risk everything for a strategic objective that could change the course of the war. Stories like Operation Chariot reveal the incredible innovation and courage that characterized World War II special operations, when ordinary men accomplished extraordinary missions through determination, skill, and willingness to attempt the impossible. From commando raids behind enemy lines to naval operations that defied all conventional wisdom, the war was filled with examples of small forces achieving strategic results through audacity and innovation. That's exactly what we explore here: the forgotten heroes, the impossible missions, and the extraordinary individuals who changed the course of history through courage and determination. If you're fascinated by stories of military innovation and individual heroism, if you want to discover more examples of how audacious planning can overcome impossible odds, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. The history of special operations is filled with ships like HMS Campbeltown and men who proved that the impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been attempted by people with enough courage and determination to risk everything for victory.